What's up, Agent Conf? It feels amazing to be back. I can't believe that the conference is finally back. Let me start with a question. Raise your hand if you think you are successful in your career. Roughly about half the audience, nice. Keep your hand up if you think you are as successful in your career as you can be. There's 2 hands up, nice. Applause for those 3 people. I think I am. And a large part of the reason why I've been able to be as successful as I am is because I've gotten lucky many times in a row. But the thing is, I didn't get lucky by chance. I made myself get lucky. I got lucky on purpose. Now that sounds kind of ridiculous, but reflecting on my career, I've discovered 6 principles that I've used over and over and over again to get lucky. My goal today is to give you this set of 6 actionable principles so that you can start applying them in your own way on Monday to be more lucky in your career. To explain where I'm coming from and to give you a bit of a concrete example of these principles, let me start by telling you the story of my career. It all started after high school when I was lazily scrolling Twitter on a Sunday afternoon, and I stumbled upon a tweet that somebody had retweeted into my feed, where an agency in London was looking for a front-end development intern. This agency was called Animate. And I thought, you know what? I want to be a front-end developer. I might as well just apply. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? You know, they're going to reject me. It'll be fine. I'll just apply. And turns out, I got that internship. And they hired me to spend 3 months in London to learn front-end web development from all the folks there. Now, after 2 months of this internship where I learned a lot, they came to me and they said, hey, we've taught you a lot about HTML and CSS. What else do you want to learn? And I said, I don't know. What should I learn? And they said, well, you know, Facebook just announced this new thing called React a few months ago, React and Flux, and we've been meaning to try it because it might solve some of our problems on some of our projects, but we don't really have time. Why don't you go build a few things with it and then tell us how it feels? And so I said, sure. And I went and for a month, and then even after the internship, after I left, I built 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 apps with React. Just small little websites where I was like, let me try this new thing, let me try this tool, let me try Mutable.js. And I tried all of the different tools. And at the time, if you were in the React ecosystem, you know, everybody was manually configuring Webpack. Now, to some of you, that might not mean anything, but that at the time meant you had a file of about 1,000 lines of code called webpack.config.js that was not documented, that you had to copy-paste around. And if one line of code was even just slightly wrong, the whole thing didn't work. It was terrible. And so I was like, this does not make sense. I can't keep copy-pasting this thing around and it breaks. I'll put it into a repository, and then I'll just keep reusing it as I build more apps. And so I took that, I pushed it to GitHub, and I called it React Boilerplate. And I kept just building apps, and I kept improving my own React Boilerplate just for myself, because I kept adding tools that I liked and removing tools that I didn't like anymore. And then one morning, I was skiing with my family, and I woke up one morning, I look at my phone, and React Boilerplate had gone from about 50 to about 500 stars overnight on GitHub. And I said, what's going on? And I tweeted, does anybody know what's going on? Why do I suddenly have 500 stars? And somebody said, you're on the front page of Hacker News. And overnight, somebody had randomly posted React Boilerplate to Hacker News. And it exploded. It stayed on the front page for the entire day. And after 2 days, it had about 3,000 stars on GitHub. Overnight, I was suddenly a famous open source developer, and I had hundreds of people using this thing that I was now tasked with maintaining. Because I built this open source project in the React ecosystem, I started speaking at some of the local meetups in Vienna, specifically React Vienna, which is a great community. And after one particularly faithful React Vienna meetup, we grabbed some beers, it was pretty late at night. I entered the underground with Nick Graff, who's one of the organizers of React Vienna. And it turned out we ended up going home in the same direction. And so we get on the underground and we keep chatting about React stuff. And eventually he goes, okay, the next stop is my stop. I'll get off here, see you next time. And I go, it's my stop too. Okay, let's just get off together then. And so we walk out the stop, and he says, okay, this is the exit that I have to walk up of. I'll see you next time. And I go, that's my exit too. Hold on, where do you live? And it turns out Nick Graff lives a solid 2 minutes away from where I live. And so we end up exiting the same underground station at the same exit, and we're both feeling kind of a little bit peckish. And so we say, you know what, let's just go to the local sausage stand in Vienna and grab some dinner, because that's pretty much the only thing that's open late at night in Vienna. And so we stand at this sausage stand and we start talking about skiing. Nick loves skiing, I love skiing, that's why I'm here. And Nick says, you know, I got a trip coming up in a few weeks. I'm actually going to Jackson Hole, Wyoming in the US to go skiing. And I go, no way, that's amazing. I've never been skiing to the US. I would love to come, can I join? And Nick goes, I guess we have a bed open. Let me ask the others. And I was able to join. I went from this meetup to joining Nick on a trip to the US to go skiing. And Jackson Hole was an amazing experience. And the thing was that Nick had actually gotten an open source fellowship from Stripe. And he had flown to the US and lived in San Francisco for 3 months to just work on open source. And so I said, you know what, I've never been to San Francisco, and it's the mecca for our industry. I'm already in the US, let me just go fly to San Francisco for a week and figure out what's actually there. And Nick says, sure. And so I went to San Francisco, and Nick and I ended up co-working at the Stripe office the whole week, just working on our own open source projects. And one day he says, you know, one of my friends from Australia called Jed Watson is in town. He's the creator of React Select, and he's done Keystone.js and a lot of other open source projects. He's also coming by to co-work. And so Nick, Jed, and I are sitting in the Stripe office in San Francisco, just hacking on our open source projects. And randomly, at some point throughout the day, I look at Jed Watson and I go, you know, Jed, it's kind of amazing that Nick just gets paid to do this for 3 months. Who gets paid to work on open source? I would love to do that. I love doing open source. And Jed looks at me kind of weird, thinks for a second, and then goes, why don't you just come do that for us? And he hired me. My first job was at ThinkMill at Jed's agency, employed full-time to maintain their open source Node.js content management system, which was absolutely mind-blowing. That is literally how I got my first job. And so they're down in Australia, so of course I got to fly down to Australia to meet the team. And as I'm down there meeting the team, Jed says, you know, a friend of mine from Melbourne is in town called Glenn Mattern. Now, some of you might have heard of Glenn Mattern. He was the creator, or still is the creator of CSS modules. And he's like, you know, I have this friend in town. He made CSS modules. I'm meeting him at this Chinese whiskey bar in downtown Sydney. Why don't you come join? And so we sit down. This is a picture of the exact table that we were sitting at. I found this on Google Street View, which is kind of ridiculous. This is the exact table in this shady Chinese whiskey bar with all these weird posters on the wall that we were sitting at. And I meet Glenn Mattern and I shake his hand, and of course we start talking about CSS, because he made CSS modules. And we were trying to build a component library at ThinkMill, but the whole CSS modules thing with Webpack, you had to copy-paste the right configuration again. It was the exact same problem. It was terrible. And so we start talking about this. I'm like, Glenn, we're having all these problems. You know, I've looked at this thing called CSS-in-JS, where you kind of put your CSS in JavaScript, but they all make you write your CSS as JavaScript and then inject it as inline styles, so it doesn't do all of the CSS things. It doesn't really feel right. And Glenn says, yeah, I agree. I've actually been looking at that space. Why don't we try making something new? And so the next day, a little bit hungover, admittedly, we sit down in the ThinkMill office and we start prototyping a new CSS-in-JS library that would let us write actual CSS in JavaScript. And that library turned out to be style components. When we launched it, it got 3,000 stars within a day and is now used by millions of developers worldwide to build many of the websites that you've probably visited every single day. Now, style components was also used by one very special person called Bryn Jackson in combination with Brian Lovin. They were building a community platform for their podcast network. And they reached out. Bryn DM'd me on Twitter and was like, hey, dude, we're using style components, but we're having some issues with it. Can you help us? And I said, hey, look, I'm happy to help. I respect your work. I love your work. Do you have a repo that I can look at? And I look at it, and I realize they're building a community platform. And I go, no way. That is exactly what I need for all of my open source projects. Can we just take this community platform and make it a platform that everyone can use, not just your community? And he goes, yeah, that makes sense. And we end up co-founding Spectrum, the company. Now, co-founding Spectrum led to really 3 really important things. 1, I became a Forbes 30 under 30, which is kind of ridiculous. By the way, Forbes, seriously, that's the picture you choose? What is that? That dude is important. He's a 30 under 30. Let us just use the most stupid picture we can find. Man, I don't know what that is all about. The second thing it led to is that Spectrum, after 1.5 years, was acquired by GitHub, which was a really big deal. And at GitHub, I got to see how GraphQL is used at scale. And the third thing was that at Spectrum, we had terrible scaling problems because I'd used a database that wasn't very well supported and didn't scale very well for our use case, called RethinkDB. The company behind it eventually shut down. It never really went anywhere. Terrible technical choice. We were also using GraphQL really heavily for our entire API layer and loved it. And in my head, I went, GraphQL clients on the client, they do caching. Why can't I not just take a GraphQL client, put it on the server, have caching for my whole API, and then not have to worry about our scaling problems? But that didn't exist. And I wrote a blog post about this, and I kind of complained about that nobody had ever solved that problem. Fast forward a few years later, I'm talking with my friend Andreas Klinger, who was the CTO of Product Hunt. And I say, Andy, you know, I'm kind of ready to do a startup again. I really want to found a new company. If you see anything, if you hear anything, let me know. If you see anything that's like up my alley, let me know. And Andy says, sure, I don't know anything right now, but I'll let you know. A few months later, he goes, Max, I just met this guy called Tim up in Berlin. Tim works at Prisma, the Node.js ORM. And he's built a prototype of a GraphQL edge cache, the exact thing that you were looking for. You should go talk to him. And so he sends this faithful email introducing me to Tim. And Tim and I end up talking, and we end up co-founding the company that I'm now the CEO of, Stellate. We've since then raised $30 million. We've built a team of 16 amazing people all around the world, and it's been a crazy journey over the last 2 years. All of this combined, this is kind of the most insane thing, to be honest, about my entire career. All of this combined led to Honeypot making a documentary movie about my career that has been watched almost 100,000 times, which is completely bonkers. You could have told me that a while ago, I would not have believed it. Now, as you listen to the story, you might think to yourself, isn't that all just luck? And the answer is yes, because that specific path was purely random. Nobody could have predicted this specific order of operations happening in exactly this way. If I hadn't scrolled Twitter on that day, or if that person that I was following hadn't retweeted that tweet about the internship, I would not have learned React. If I hadn't learned React, I would not have made React boilerplate. If somebody hadn't posted it on Hacker News, I would have not become open source famous. You can just keep going through the list, and every single step seems to be completely random. Now, the thing is, yes, it was luck, but no, it wasn't luck. The specific path was random, but like I said, I didn't get lucky by chance. I got lucky on purpose. If this specific path hadn't worked out in this specific way, if I weren't standing here today with this career behind me, a different path would have happened by chance, and I have no doubt that I would be equally successful. Now, how do I know this? It's because I work in a way that increases my luck surface area. I give myself as many chances to be lucky as possible. And there's 6 principles that I've used throughout my career to increase my luck surface area and give me the best chance at being lucky, which make me very confident that I would have gotten lucky no matter what. The first principle that I live by is that I maximize shots on goal. There's a famous saying by an ice hockey player called Wayne Gretzky: you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Yes, I have 2 really famous open source projects. Yes, I have 1 company now that's really successful. I've built a product that people love. What you don't see is I've done thousands of open source contributions. I've created more than 100 open source projects, most of which none of you have ever heard of or used. I've built 5 different SaaS products and shipped them to production and launched them that probably none of you have ever heard of or used either, right? I maximized my shots on goal. I did a lot of things, and some of them ended up being really successful by chance, but I tried hundreds of things. I really tried to maximize my shots on goal. The second principle that I live by is that I default to open. I'm very open to opportunities. If you listen to my story, every single step of the way, I was like, new opportunity? Let's do it. I've never done anything like this before. I'm happy to try it. Let's just go do it. I was always open to opportunities. And the other thing about default to open is that there's a second angle to it. I was open to share. I realized that ideas are really cheap. I meet a lot of people and they come to me, they're like, hey, look, I have this really secret idea for this product or this open source project that I think could be really successful. But I'm not going to tell you because it's my idea. And I'm like, you're never going to get anywhere. Because what matters is the execution. For example, React Boilerplate. When I launched React Boilerplate, when it was popular on Hacker News, there were already more than a dozen React Boilerplates out there. By the time that, by now, there's hundreds, if not thousands of React Boilerplates out there, right? But React Boilerplate was the most popular one because I executed really well. And in fact, it became so popular because I spoke with a lot of people about my ideas. I went and I said, look, I'm making a red boilerplate. I put this tool in it. What do you think? And they went, you know what? We tried that tool at Airbnb in production at scale, and it really didn't work for these and these reasons. We've now found this other tool that works way better that nobody's ever heard of. And I went, oh, let me put that into my boilerplate. I was really open with my ideas, and I was always open to changing my mind. The thing about having good ideas that I've realized is that really good ideas seem super obvious to the person that has the idea. Because in order to have a good idea, you need to combine things that are already around in a novel way. So if you think about style components, for example, at the time when we made style components, CSS-in-JS was already a thing. Radium, JSS, people had built CSS-in-JS libraries before. There was this idea floating around the React community of style components, of having components like a grid or a row or a column, components that did nothing but style things. That also already existed. And we added our own opinion on that, which was that we wanted to write actual CSS. We love actual CSS. Again, lots of people do. And we took those three ideas and we were like, let's see what happens when we combine these three ideas that we like into one package. And it worked out beautifully. Everybody else went, how did you come up with that? That is ridiculous. I would have never thought to do that. To us, it was obvious. And that's the thing about having good ideas. The best ideas seem really obvious to you because you have a lot of input and you have a lot of data and you realize the things that you like. And so you combine different patterns and different ideas in one new idea. The question then is, how can you have enough input to actually have all these pieces? And that is my third principle, which is to be genuinely interested. I live and die by something that my mom, I think, exemplified, which is that every person has something interesting to tell you. Every single person. And that is how I live my life. Every conversation I get into, I try to understand what is interesting about the other person. I don't always succeed, because I don't know which questions to ask. It's actually kind of tricky to figure out. But when you can, I found that I can learn something from everyone. In fact, in high school, the best example I can think of is in high school, I was best friends with our cleaning lady, Frau Joka. Nobody ever spoke with her, and I had some great conversations with her over the course of my high school career. And we ended up becoming really good friends, and I learned a lot from her. When you're genuinely interested, you learn new things, and the other thing that happens is that people want to talk to you. Because it turns out, people really like talking about themselves. People really like to share their thoughts and their opinions. And so when you're genuinely interested, people keep telling you more and more and more things and they want to talk to you. And so you end up in this positive virtuous cycle where you just learn more and more and more and more and more things and you get more input. A lot of the things that I heard of, for example, for style components with CSS-in-JS, with style components, I learned because I talked to people. I talked to people in the community, I talked to people in the ecosystem. I was like, what's worked for you? How are you doing on this? Why does this suck? What is new in your ecosystem? And through that, I got all this input that I was able to combine in a novel way. The fourth principle that I live by, and that is sort of the counterpart to be genuinely interested, is that you have to be able to communicate effectively. If you're able to communicate effectively, it opens so many doors because you can build so much deeper connections. Now, communicating effectively has two parts. The first part of being able to communicate effectively is listening. My partner always tells our kids, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen first, then speak. And you should be listening twice as much as you're speaking. And it's true. When you're talking with somebody, you want to listen much more than you speak. And you have to listen to understand. Many people just stand there and they listen and they're hearing the words, but they're not really trying to understand. Try to really sit there and hear what is the intent of what my conversation partner is trying to tell me. What can I learn from this? Once you're listening and understanding what the other person is saying, then the challenge becomes you have to be able to think yourself clearly and be able to communicate your thoughts and opinions clearly so that the other person can hear it. And there's one very specific way I found to improve this, which is really uncomfortable at first, but works really well, which is to watch yourself communicate. I've given 30 or 40 conference talks now all around the world. And believe it or not, I've watched every single one of my conference talks back. Which seems ridiculous because I gave the talk, so I know what the talk is about. But I'm not watching for the content. I'm watching to watch myself communicate. And invariably, even after 40 conference talks that I've watched, every single time I have a new learning. I'm like, oh, I could have communicated that better. Or, oh, that pacing wasn't quite right. Or, oh, you know, that point wasn't as clearly communicated as it could have been. I have an idea on how to do it better. Every single time. In fact, this is now a part of my practice. When I practice conference talks, even this one, I record myself giving the talk just at home in front of my laptop, and then I watch it back to see what I could do better. That is one key way that I found to be able to communicate better. My fifth principle is that I play infinite games. Now, what does that mean? That is a concept that was made popular by a guy named Simon Sinek. And a finite game, so the opposite of an infinite game, a finite game is, for example, sports. It's where you have a ranking, and there's one number 1, there's one number 2, there's one number 3, there's one number 4, and so on. There's a very clear ranking about who's the winner and who's the loser every single time. The problem with finite games and when you play finite games is that the entire ecosystem is completely disincentivized from helping each other. If I'm the number 2 on the leaderboard in tennis, for example, and I see that my opponent, who's the number 1, is doing something wrong, I'm not going to go and tell him about that. I would never do that, because that's my advantage, right? I can exploit that to win against the person, and then I can be number 1. I'm disincentivized from telling the person how they could be better. I'm incentivized to keep all of my observations to myself. This is very different than when you play infinite games. So infinite games are games where there's no clear ranking. Open source is an example. Yes, you can rank GitHub repositories by stars, but they all solve such different problems that it doesn't matter, right? There could be one successful open source project, there could be 100, there could be 1,000, there could be 1,000,000. In fact, there is probably 1,000,000 successful open source projects, each and every single one successful in their own right. And the thing about infinite games is that people are not disincentivized from helping each other, which means I can ping somebody who's made a successful open source project, and then I can be like, hey, you know, I really like this README that you put together. It really clearly outlines the problem you're solving and why your solution is better. How did you come up with that? What is your secret? And yes, not everybody will have the time to respond, but I found over the course of my career, most people are more than happy to help. Because it's an infinite game, they don't lose anything, right? They can help me, and we all become more successful. We all make more connections. The same thing is true in a startup ecosystem. Startups, except for if you're directly competing, are an infinite game. There could be 1,000,000 successful startups, probably are, and there's no ranking, right? Which means in the startup ecosystem, I found I can ping people who've built wildly successful companies, and I can ask them specific questions, and usually I get answers back, which seems kind of ridiculous. I can ask the founder of GitHub, hey, how did you think about levels for software engineers early on? You famously didn't have any. How did that work out when you introduced them? And I got a response back, right? And I've done that over and over and over again. So I play infinite games. I play games where people are incentivized to help each other. And then my sixth and final principle is to embrace feedback. This seems really simple. Every feedback is an opportunity for growth, duh. But the thing about getting really good feedback is that really, really good feedback, and you know it's good when it's really uncomfortable. When you receive really good feedback, you go, ugh. It's that feeling of like, oh, that's uncomfortable, that hurts, ooh, that's so true, ooh, I didn't think about that, oh, ooh. And the default reaction that people have, including me when that happens, is defensiveness, right? You go, ooh, that's uncomfortable, stay away from me, right? I don't want to hear this. And if you can get over that, if you can go, okay, that really hurt. Now, let me see what I can do better based on this feedback. Then you will be able to grow a lot. And in fact, the best example I can give of this is not even about feedback. It's what I said earlier about watching yourself communicate. Most people tell me that when they watch themselves give a talk or on a podcast, they go, ooh, they find it really uncomfortable, and so they never do it. But the reason they find it uncomfortable, the reason it is uncomfortable to watch yourself communicate is because you realize all the ways you could be doing it better. And then instead of actually looking at the ways you could be doing it better and improving, they go, ooh, no, I'm never going to watch myself communicate. But that's a big mistake, because that's a huge learning opportunity. So embrace feedback, get over that, and embrace it to grow and learn and get better much faster than anyone else can. So, to summarize, my 6 principles to get lucky are maximize shots on goal, default to open, be genuinely interested, communicate effectively, play infinite games, and embrace feedback. To circle back to the beginning, I said that my goal was to leave you with actionable principles that you can apply in your own way on Monday. So what does that look like? For example, you can try sharing one of your ideas with your friends, or even post it on Twitter. You can talk to a person at this conference. There's 200 really interesting people at this conference. Go talk to somebody and be like, hey, what makes you interesting? What are you doing? What are you curious about? What are you learning right now? You can watch yourself communicate. Even if you're just listening to an audio message that you sent on WhatsApp, I promise you, you'll learn something about the way that you communicate. You can open source one of the projects that you have laying around in your GitHub dormant, that you have never open sourced. You can try applying some feedback that you got last week. There's a million ways you can apply these principles. But I hope they're actionable, and you can, on Monday, go ahead and apply them in your own way for yourself. And when you do, I'd love to hear about it. please ping me at mxsdbr on Twitter. I'd love to hear about how you applied these principles to increase your Lux surface area. I'll close off by saying that you can increase your Lux surface area by following these principles. But there's one way that I got lucky that is absolutely pure luck that I had no control over, and that is growing up with an amazing family. My parents and sister are in the audience and hearing me live for the first time ever. I've given 40 conference talks, and they've been all over the world, and they've never made it to listen to me live. So this is a very special occasion for me. And the thing is, I wouldn't be who I am, and I couldn't have done any of this without the love and support of my parents, brothers, and sisters. Thank you for being here.